When we think about Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia in 1812, one image tends to dominate: ragged French soldiers, frozen in snowdrifts, falling victim to the infamous Russian winter. For many, the explanation is straightforward. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest military commander of his era, could not defeat the merciless cold of Russia. But is this the whole story? Was it just frost, snow, and sub-zero temperatures that halted the advance of the Grande Armée and changed the course of history? Or was the downfall of Napoleon's army a far more complex chain of events, rooted as much in strategy, logistics, and Russian resistance as it was in the weather itself? In the spring of 1812, Napoleon assembled what was, at the time, the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 men drawn not only from France, but from across his empire. With this grand coalition, he set his sights on Tsar Alexander I and the sprawling Russian Empire. The plan appeared simple: advance into Russia, force the Tsar into battle, secure a decisive victory, and compel peace on French terms. Yet, from the outset, things did not go according to plan. The Russians, well aware of Napoleon's military prowess, refused to engage him in a pitched battle. Instead, their armies conducted a strategic retreat, pulling eastward and denying Napoleon the kind of swift victory he so often achieved. As they withdrew, the Russians employed a scorched earth policy, destroying villages, crops, and supplies as they went. This left Napoleon's men struggling to find food and shelter, even in the relatively mild weather of summer. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September, the city had been abandoned, and then set alight by its own inhabitants. There was no Russian delegation to receive him, and no supplies to replenish his now exhausted soldiers. The French, expecting triumph and hospitality, found instead a devastated city, lacking the food and shelter necessary for their survival. It was only after a month-long futile wait in Moscow that Napoleon decided to retreat. It is here that the Russian winter, so infamous in Western imagination, entered the story. As the army began its long march home, the temperature began to plummet rapidly. Horses collapsed in droves, their carcasses soon frozen solid. Soldiers, many already starving, faced blizzards and icy winds. Frostbite, disease, and starvation claimed lives by the tens of thousands. Crossing the swollen and icy Berezina River proved catastrophic. Desperate, wounded, and starving, the troops faced not only the elements, but also pursued by the Russian army and partisan fighters. But to pin Napoleon's defeat solely on the weather is to ignore the strategic failures that set the stage for disaster. The army was unprepared for a lengthy campaign deep in hostile territory. Supplying such a massive force across such vast distances proved impossible, especially with the Russians systematically denying them resources. Morale plummeted as desertion increased and discipline eroded. By the time the true depths of winter hit, the Grande Armée was already in a desperate state, a weakened, shattered semblance of its former self. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that the Russian winter was not, at least initially, especially harsh. The worst of the cold did not arrive until November, well after disease, hunger, and lack of supplies had decimated Napoleon's men. The general winter legend, while rooted in the very real suffering endured by the retreating army, serves to simplify a far messier reality: that it was human decisions, Napoleon's overconfidence, logistical shortcomings, Russian strategy, and the sheer scale of the invasion that trapped France in a nightmare from which they could not awaken. In the end, the Russian winter did play a part in Napoleon's undoing, but it was not the lone architect of his downfall. The seeds of catastrophe were sown in the planning, in the resistance of the Russian people, and in the relentless pressure of a war fought not just against the cold, but against the limits of human endurance, willpower, and the unforgiving sweep of history itself. These overlapping hardships were amplified by the immense scale of Napoleon's campaign. As the French forces advanced deeper into Russia, their supply lines stretched thin, and essential resources dwindled. The Russians expertly avoided open battles, drawing the invaders ever farther while denying them the ability to live off the land. Outbreaks of disease and the ever-present threat of starvation steadily eroded the Grande Armée's strength. By the time winter truly set in, their fate was already sealed by exhaustion and deprivation. As the French forces pressed further into Russian territory, the consequences of the scorched earth strategy became increasingly severe. Fields were set ablaze, granaries emptied, and even entire towns left smoldering ruins in the army's wake. Each mile of advance meant deeper isolation from supply lines, with hunger and exhaustion mounting. These deliberate acts of destruction denied Napoleon's troops sustenance and shelter, transforming the vast Russian landscape itself into a powerful, unrelenting adversary. The Battle of Borodino stands as one of the bloodiest single-day engagements in history, marking a pivotal moment in Napoleon's 1812 campaign. Despite immense losses on both sides, the French claimed a costly victory but were unable to shatter the Russian forces. The Russians retreated in good order, preserving their army for future resistance. This Pyrrhic triumph forced Napoleon to press onward, driving his exhausted troops ever deeper into Russia, with victory slipping further from his grasp. Napoleon's arrival in Moscow was met not with triumph, but with a haunting emptiness. The city, once the heart of Russia, had been deserted by its residents and deliberately set ablaze. Flames devoured homes, markets, and stores of precious supplies, leaving behind only smoldering ruins. Instead of the safe haven he expected, Napoleon found deprivation and despair. This fateful moment underscored the relentlessness of the Russian strategy and marked a turning point in the ill-fated campaign. Marching westward through devastated lands, Napoleon's army faced relentless pressure. Russian regulars and guerrilla bands attacked stragglers, isolated detachments, and supply convoys, chipping away at the once grand force. Morale collapsed as hunger set in and chaos spread. Soldiers who had once marched with pride now struggled to survive, scavenging for scraps as discipline broke down. With every mile, casualties mounted, not just from battle or cold, but from exhaustion, disease, and the sheer hopelessness of their situation. As the savage Russian winter descended in November, temperatures plummeted to unimaginable lows, reaching -35 degrees Celsius. Ill-prepared for such relentlessly harsh conditions, Napoleon's troops suffered immensely. Lacking adequate clothing and supplies, soldiers faced frostbite and hypothermia, with countless men succumbing to the bitter cold. Starvation and disease swept through the ranks, compounding the devastation. What began as a grand campaign ended with a harrowing retreat, marked by suffering, chaos, and the near destruction of the once mighty Grande Armée. The staggering losses suffered by Napoleon's army during the Russian campaign sent shockwaves across Europe. Out of the vast force of 600,000 men that had marched into Russia with such high hopes, a mere fraction, around 100,000, struggled back across the border. This devastating reduction in military strength left the French Empire vulnerable, emboldened its enemies, and shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. The consequences rippled beyond the battlefield, marking the beginning of the end for Napoleon's reign.